The Constitutional Court is expediting its review of the impeachment trial of President Yoon Suk-yeol, with widespread interest in when a conclusion might be reached. The court has emphasized that it will prioritize the case above all others. To discuss the procedures we can expect moving forward, we are joined by Dean Hee-eun from the Handong International Law School. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you.
Yes, thank you. So the impeachment trial was triggered by actually the declaration of martial law. So what exactly is martial law in a simple term? Is it unique to South Korea, or does it have any distinctive characteristics here?
Right. So martial law is a situation where there's basically a suspension of civil liberties because of a national emergency, something like a war happens, or there's chaos in the public. And as a result, the government decides that because order needs to be established quickly, martial law will be declared. And so when a martial law declaration occurs, then essentially the military basically assumes control of all the administrative and civilian functions that you normally would find in a regular situation. So what this means is there are widespread implications for this. So for instance, civil liberties will be basically suspended. Search and seizure, of course, will be now not subject to warrants, but now be permitted by the military authorities. And the military commander essentially is now set in place to rule over the country for a time. Now, in the Korean context, the Korean Constitution provides in basically Article 77 that martial law can be declared under certain circumstances. And that would be, for example, like a war breaks out, for example, or something where there would cause some kind of chaos. And so under the Korean Constitution, there's a specific provision that provides for this. But also there's a statutory law called the Martial Law Act that also elaborates further legal standards for the imposition of martial law. And it further gives standards by which you define when martial law can actually be declared. And so Korea is unique in some sense because the Constitution provides for it, but also there's a statutory provision that actually puts forward the procedures as well as the legal standards by which martial law can be carried out. So in that sense, martial law in this context is pretty unique to Korea, but in terms of actual imposition, many countries have imposed it over time. And so countries like the United States, other democracies like in France, for instance, but also in developing countries where martial law has been declared because of, for example, some kind of political chaos.
Okay.
And so as a result, martial law is not necessarily unique, but the statutory sort of legal framework for martial law is pretty interesting in Korea.
That's interesting, perhaps because of the history of democratic development here in South Korea. Right?
Absolutely.
Now, another term that our viewers may find unfamiliar can be insurrection. So what is insurrection, and what actions actually constitute insurrection? Right.
So under the Criminal Act of Korea, Article 87 provides a specific definition for what insurrection is. And insurrection really is when someone causes violence for the purpose of two circumstances. So one, usurping national territory, or in this case, maybe potentially subverting the Constitution. So essentially, it's someone who basically takes violent actions, either plans it, participates in it, and basically puts forward a set of circumstances by which, there's going to be in the Korean context now, whether the subversion of the Constitution. Now, there's some historical precedent for this because there have been other cases in Korea where insurrection has been found as a criminal law violation. So the most recent case was in 2015. So Lee Suk-gi, he was the party of a very small progressive party who was accused of insurrection and found guilty. He was eventually confirmed to sentence to 9 years in prison. And he was involved in planning potentially disruptions to the Korean government with respect to maybe collaborating with North Korea. And so insurrection was laid a charge against him, and he was convicted of it. But even in if we go back further, and this is at the presidential level, Chun Doo-hwan and No Tae-woo, of course, previous presidents of Korea, they were also found guilty of insurrection. Now, they were guilty of other things as well. But they were accused of subverting the Constitution, and particularly, and this may have relevance to this case involving President Yoon, is blockading and preventing the National Assembly from meeting. And so because there's some parallels between President Chun and President No and President Yoon, people are thinking about whether or not he would be in line of being accused and convicted of insurrection. Now, his argument, President Yoon's case, is that he's not involved in insurrection because he's not actually, preventing the National Assembly. He didn't actually do that. While there was a temporary blockade, unlike the previous cases where they went for days, where the National Assembly could not meet. In this case, as soon as the National Assembly met, they lifted the order, and then he, of course, withdrew the martial law. But that's a question that the courts are going to have to define. But in terms of insurrection itself, there's a clear criminal legal issue here that I think in this case the prosecutors will pursue against President Yoon.
So then the next question will be, what kind of penalties are for, corroborated insurrection charges? Can you give us some domestic or international examples?
Absolutely. I mean, the case involving the president particularly is very, very severe because if he's in fact found guilty of insurrection, the criminal code of Korea provides that you can be subject to the death penalty or life imprisonment. And that's if you're the leader of the insurrection. And so in the previous case I mentioned to you, Representative Lee Seok-gi, he was not the ringleader necessarily, but he was sentenced to 9 years in prison because he participated in an insurrection. And so the penalties are extremely severe, of the highest order when it comes to insurrection, because this threatens the life of the state. And so, as you can imagine, when it comes to this crime, countries around the world will treat this in a similar kind of crime. Let's say treason would be of a similar nature, would be of the highest order against the country. Now, in the United States, as you may know, there was some accusation about President Trump. When the presidential election in 2020, when President Biden was elected, on January 6th, there was some people call it a riot, some people call it insurrection, that he was participating because he encouraged people to riot. And so in that case, there was an accusation made against President Trump that he was involved in insurrection. But in any event, I mean, the crime of insurrection is going to be treated very harshly when it comes to legal authorities around the world.
Yeah. You mentioned the role of Constitutional Court, and now it has 180 days, right? But considering the past cases, like Roh Moo-hyun's impeachment was dismissed within 63 days, and in the case of Park Geun-hye's impeachment case, it was upheld in 91 days. Sorry. So what kind of processes can take place during this period?
Right. And as you mentioned, as soon as the resolution was met and the case is now going to the Constitutional Court, the court has 180 days to decide, to adjudicate the case. Now, there's a couple of complications here. There are actually two, because first, the issue about, for example, the pending criminal trial potentially could delay the actual impeachment trial itself. So according to the Constitutional Court Act, if there's a pending criminal trial, that criminal trial can take precedence. And so basically what will happen is the Constitutional Court will then stay the proceedings, which means to delay the proceedings until the criminal trial actually is brought forth and charges are confirmed, he's acquitted or convicted. That could take quite some time. But that's up to the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court in this case has discretion whether to stay the proceedings or to continue with the impeachment trial itself. But there's also another question here, is whether President Yoon will respond in a timely manner when it comes to documents that the Constitutional Court submits to him. Because as a matter of due process, the court needs to give him notice, and that notice needs to be received by him. And the question is whether or not he will actually physically receive that notice, whether it'll be emailed to him, whether he'll get it by personal delivery. The court has done those things so far, but President Yoon has not responded. So there's an issue there about when the proceedings will commence with respect to his notification. But if he does, sometimes irrespective of notification, because the court sometimes has ruled that even if he hasn't personally received it himself, but he's gotten at his residence or he's been emailed that notification, the trial will proceed. And if the trial does in fact proceed, you have now the process laying out where you have a presiding judge who will call a meeting for the justices, and then the justice will then devise a plan to how to proceed with the trial itself. And then once the trial happens, then there will be a summons issued to the president. The president may or may not appear, but that is really of no relevance. He'll be given time, but if he doesn't appear, the trial will proceed with or without him. And then, of course, then you have questioning and you have evidence, and it proceeds like a normal trial. And then once the trial process is completed, the evidence is now submitted, the court will then deliberate. And the justice will then decide whether or not to convict him or not, or acquit. And basically, of course, if he's impeached and the conviction is upheld, he will have to be removed from office and we'll have a new election for the president. But if he's acquitted, then he can return back to his office with the full powers he had before the impeachment.
Okay, the process seems to be quite clear to me right now. But, well, separation of power is very critical to democracy, right? But there are some who are concerned that perhaps political leaning can have an impact on the court's decision in handling all these cases. Do you think that can happen?
I mean, there's always that possibility. The way that the Korean Constitutional Court is comprised and how justices are appointed, basically there's supposed to be a distribution among the different political entities, legal bodies, to ensure that there's not this political influence that potentially could upset the court. And so, as you may know, 3 justices will be directly appointed by the president, and then 3 justices will be elected by the National Assembly and then appointed by the president, and then 3 other justices will be elected by the Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Korea, and then to be appointed by the president. So the idea is it's supposed to provide sort of an ideological sort of balance.
Right.
If there's some possibility that the justices may have particular leaning because, let's say, the president approved the justice and therefore may be more conservative versus the National Assembly, which is controlled by the more progressive party, that those justices will be more progressive. So there's always the possibility that their political leanings could influence a judge. But I think justices generally, of course, will take an oath to basically not let the politics influence their decisions. But human nature being as it is, there could always be that potential problem. But I think at this point, I think generally people do not think that the political leanings will have a direct impact because the whole country is watching the court very carefully. So there's a lot of pressure on the court not to take sides. And if you look at the impeachment of President Park Geun-hye, progressive and conservative justices voted for her impeachment. So I think there's a lot of confidence in the court that they will not make a political decision in this case.
All right. And related to that issue, actually, the Constitutional Court has 9 judges, but now it has 6 judges, right? So do you think it'll take time, and how the court will proceed with the 6 judges or 9 judges? How do you foresee the whole process?
This is quite a conundrum for the court because under the Constitutional Court rules themselves, in order to actually make an adjudication and then eventually a decision, you have to have at least 7 justices on the court. And so right now, as you mentioned, that there are only 6. And the acting Chief Justice seemed to suggest, at least publicly in terms of news reports and his comments to the media, that they can proceed with 6 justices. Now, there's precedent for that if, in this case, in the previous situation where, as you know, the Progressive Party of the National Assembly has impeached many of President Yoon's officials, and one of those officials asked the court to just decide the case with 6, and the court allowed it. But in this case, formally the court rules themselves provide that you should have at least 7. And so if there aren't 7, formally you cannot have an adjudication. If you can't have an adjudication, then of course, in that situation, the process needs to be stopped at some point. So this is the big back and forth now, I think, procedurally, is whether in fact you need actual 7 justices. Now, in order for the impeachment to actually be confirmed, you have to have 6 justices vote in favor of it. So if they do proceed with 6 justices, it has to be a unanimous decision, because even if one justice votes against the impeachment and conviction of the impeachment, then President Yoon will go back to his office of president. So this puts the court in a really big, I think, problem, because you need to have at least 7. And of course, given the magnitude of this case, it would certainly be best to have a full bench, and that full bench would include 9 justices. And that's now the big tussle back and forth in the National Assembly, is the 3 justices that will now be elected by the National Assembly. If they do in fact go through with it, then President Han, Prime Minister Han, who's now the acting president, will now have to appoint them, and he can choose to appoint them or not to appoint them. So there's a potentially huge constitutional crisis when it comes to this impeachment, because of the whole procedure of the Constitutional Court.
Yeah, but still, I believe that the people in South Korea and also in the global community want to see very smooth proceeding of this.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you for your insights. I think let's wrap up today's discussion. Thank you.
It was a pleasure being here.